I'm Jeffrey Gibson, and my day job was being an activities manager at Ikea in Bayonne, New Jersey.
Jeff, it is so great to be in conversation with you, and it was such a pleasure to get to work with you and share your solo exhibition, Jeffrey Gibson, This is the Day, at the Blanton in 2019. And in retrospect, I am so incredibly grateful that your show happened before the pandemic, since it was very beloved here in Austin. And I am thrilled to have you here today, and thank you for coming. One of the things that I learned about your practice from that exhibition and the organizing curator, Tracy Adler, is that you worked for IKEA early on in your career, which was something I hadn't been aware of. And then I have to say that when Tracy mentioned this, that it somehow made sense. And I think you were so sensitive to how your work was presented in the exhibition in a way that a thoughtfulness and thinking about, especially in that gallery devoted to your garments, I felt like you really thought about the overall presentation and the way different works were displayed next to others. And it was such a dramatic and powerful installation. People really admired and commented when they would walk into that gallery. So I wanted to just start with, your early years as an artist, and after you graduated from art school in London, what was the sort of first memorable day job you held to support yourself?
When we first moved to New York City, and that was me and my husband, Rooney, and we were subletting an apartment on East 4th Street. And, Macy's always hired holiday help, like to help with merchandising. And it was kind of, like a thing that artists would get on the circuit for merchandising, for visual merchandising. And so I was kind of throwing out a wide net. And I bought a suit, and granted we were broke. And so buying a suit was a big deal. And I went to a temp agency, and I walked in, and the woman took me back into her office, and she's like, "I'm so excited. You look amazing. You look the part. I feel really good about this. I know we're going to land you a job by the end of today." And then she said, "But first, I need you to take this typing test." And I'm horrible at typing. And so I went into this other room, and I took this typing test. And, I thought maybe I did okay, like maybe C plus-ish. And I came in, and she looked really disappointed. And she said, "I'm really sorry to tell you, but you didn't do well. We're not going to be able to find you a job by the end of today." And then she said I could come back daily and take free typing courses. And so that was really depressing, that I had just completed a master's degree, and, it just didn't feel good. And so then I went to the Macy's interview, which was a large kind of cattle call interview. And I remember I got hired on the spot, and my first job, which was kind of a hazing, I think, was they had these aluminum or steel ribbon Christmas trees that had to be taken and untangled out of cardboard boxes and then polished. And it was literally like aluminum or steel ribbon that you got cut on. And so they warned you, you're probably going to get cut, so just be careful. And you literally took all day long with this probably toxic spray and these rags, and just sort of slowly kind of polished up these metal trees. And I had that job for some time. And then I kind of took that. I thought that was my experience. And I moved into being a visual merchandiser at Ikea in Bayonne. And by that point, we had moved out of the city into North Bergen, New Jersey. And, my job was basically, the rooms that you go into at Ikea. That was my job. Was we would get kind of a packet and a little rundown of what the room should be, what furniture it needed to focus on. And I guess I did well at that job. And then I got promoted to what's referred to as the activities manager, which I don't know if IKEA still does this, but when you walk in and there's 50 chairs, screwed to the wall, that became my job, was to kind of make these big visual statements when people walked into the store. And that was, I was there for a good year and a half.
So going back to the Macy's job, were the trees you were working on, were those in the window? Were you working on sort of window display?
No, the window display was a few steps up from where I was. Like, well, you were literally, there's the David Sedaris like story about, the Christmas kind of holiday scene at Macy's, and that's legitimate. I was definitely on the lowest kind of rung of like entry level, you know, and so my trees probably were like in the menswear department, like, and had like ties underneath them or something. I didn't make it to the windows. That was the dream.
But then you made it to the front of the store by the time you got to IKEA eventually.
Yes, I did. Pretty quickly. I mean, I think, part of it was when you left New York City and you had New York City experience in retail, you kind of like walked in with some pedigree. And my bosses at the time were two women who, they paid attention to the art world, of kind of the 90s. So I think they felt like, here was somebody who shared maybe similar interests. And so I felt a little favoritism for sure.
And so you were living in New Jersey with your husband at the time. Were you working part-time, full-time, daytime, nighttime?
I was working full time. I would get up at 6 a.m. I probably had to leave the house. I think we were supposed to be there by 7. And I had to wear that awful uniform of Navy. And yeah, I think I was just so, Rooney, my husband at the time, we didn't have health insurance. We were still organizing his visa situation. So I just felt like my responsibility was to provide as much stability for us as possible. Rooney's Norwegian and didn't ever see himself living in New York City. So it was sort of on my behalf that we ended up moving to the United States. And we were both just out of graduate school, kind of figuring everything out.
So were you making work then? I mean, that sounds exhausting and pretty all consuming, but were you able to make work in the evenings or sometimes on the weekend? Like, tell me what you're doing in your art practice then at the time.
At the time, I mean, no. I mean, we had a space. We were living in a large loft space. So we had set up like studios, but I think we were still trying to figure out like how to juggle everything. So I had a studio and I would probably go in there and work sometimes, but there was no consistency to it. There was certainly, I had no network. We didn't move here with a network. We were not introduced to the art world in any way. So we were really starting from like ground zero for sure. And I think those first years, and this would have been 99, probably through about 2000 and I'm going to guess about 2002. Just totally like green, nervous, scared, just trying to stay afloat. And excited. I will say excited too.
Yeah, no, but that sounds, I think for anyone who's moved to New York from somewhere else, knows that experience pretty well of precarity and nervousness and excitement and all of those and the challenges. And so you said, tell me a little bit more. I think you said did you say you were an activities manager? That
Yeah,
was you
that
were
was my
promoted to
title.
activities.
Yeah.
Okay. Tell me more about what you did sort of day to day. Like, do you have any memories of that, of sort of things you loved doing or highlights or lowlights?
I mean, I think, with artists, I feel like, especially at that period in my life, like I was so determined to like be creative in whatever it is I was doing. And like kind of almost thinking that I was going to prove to everybody that I'm really creative. So you really want me here and you really want to like, promote me. And so I remember probably one of the first ones I did, they had these like kind of, they weren't cages because they didn't have cages on them. They were more like these large frame cubes. And we were meant to do these installations of product inside of these cubes, and they were on wheels. And it was the first thing you saw when you came in the store. They were probably, I'm going to guess, about 12 feet by 12 feet cubed. And I did an installation of lighting fixtures. And I did it so that I tried to make it all appear like they were families and they were all animated. So they were all kind of looking at each other or shining onto each other or staring at the shadow of one that was being lit by another one. And I just remember being so completely like proud of it. And at the time, I have to admit, I mean, IKEA is an interesting company because, it does come from socialist roots. And so the idea of kind of mixing these things, like kind of like culture, creativity, fun, and product, it was at the time, I didn't, I didn't think there was, I didn't have like distaste for IKEA. Um, and interestingly enough, I think it's something that model, their originating model, doesn't really translate well into the American economy. Um, but yeah, so I did that, and I remember people thinking like that was really cool, and they got it. They were kind of like, oh my gosh, those are like three little babies, and that big lamp is putting them to sleep, and that other big lamp is watching. And so I felt really good about that, and that may have actually been the time. I think that was the time when, so Ingvar Kvam, who's the founder of IKEA, which is a really amazing story of the founding of IKEA, and he came to visit the store in Bayonne, and he came there because we were the East Coast kind of hub. It's where like it was, just the biggest turnover store, and so he came, and I guess he asked who did those installations, and they pointed him in my direction. And very quickly he was like, this is exactly what should be happening like in every IKEA store. And at the time there was a position that they were wanting me to apply for, to move abroad to Malmo, Sweden, to basically work in a studio creating these installations, and then instructions would be written about the installations, and that would be sent out to other visual um, assistants and managers. And so, and at the time, like I said, I felt like my responsibility was to provide as much stability for myself and Rooney. And so I jumped on it immediately, and I said I was interested. And that kicked off a series of interviews where I had to learn about the Swedish family, Swedish culture, the roots of IKEA. You take a few tests, and then you have another interview. And then by the time I got to my third interview, the human resources manager, we were about 20 minutes into the third interview, and she just said to me, she said, if it's okay with you, I'm going to stop this interview and go off record. And she said, I've looked at your resume here, and I see that you're an artist, you've gone to art school, you got your master's degree, you've exhibited. She said, I'm sure you didn't move to New York City to work at IKEA. And she said, is that true? And I said, yeah, that's true. And she said, well, I'm going to stop the interview today. She said, we can pick it up again tomorrow where we're at. She's like, but I just want you to go home and think about, if you take this position, she's like, it's going to radically change the trajectory of your life. And she said, I just want you to go home and think about if this is something that you really want to do. So I went home, and I asked, talked to Rooney, and I said, what do you think? And he said, well, is this what you want to do? And I said, no, but, how are we going to take care of ourselves? And so anyways, I went in the next day and I put in my resignation, and she was very gracious about it. And I just made a promise to myself that I would never work in a non-arts related field. And I had it just at that time, I still had decent credit, and I got a loan from Apple to buy a computer. And I think my loan was like $7,000. And I think I spent $2,000 on the computer. And that $5,000, I was like, by the time this $5,000 is spent, I will be working in arts related jobs. And that kind of kicked off me working as an educator, working on, interpretive materials for museum exhibitions. And then ultimately teaching. But yeah, that was kind of a good time. And there was one other part about IKEA. One of the things that everybody had to do at IKEA, if you were in the visual department, was every morning we had these carts, and you push your cart around that kind of maze of IKEA. And when you see a light bulb that's out, you basically get out your ladder, you climb up, you change the light bulb, and you carry this bag of light bulbs around. And sometimes the store, you're supposed to be done by the time the store opens. And sometimes you were just finishing up the last few light bulbs, and customers would be kind of beginning to flood in. And I remember one time I was up on a ladder changing a light bulb, and a customer came by and just said, can you tell me how to get to kitchens or something? And I said, well, you do this, and go that way, and you'll find kitchens. And she literally walked off probably for a good like 3 or 4 minutes and then came back. And she called me down and she said, I know this is none of my business. And I said, yeah. And she said, but what are you doing here? And I was like, what do you mean? And she said, you just don't seem like this is where you should be. And I was like, huh. I was like, well, I work here. And she was like, okay. She's like, well, she said, it just strikes me that you're supposed to be someplace else. And so there was like weird things like that happened too. So that was an odd one.
That's so interesting. And I do love what you said about the HR manager, because I think in my experience, HR is always on the side of the company. And the fact that that's what they're trained to do, to represent the company, to do what's best in the best interest of the company, not of the individual. So the fact that this person essentially went a little off script, and I mean, that's kind of I'm sure you've thought about that advice. Like, it's really will stay with you forever.
For sure. And I think it's also just sort of because I do recognize that it's completely off script. It's not to be expected. It just definitely made me think that when things like that happen, it's like, just stop and like think about it, and I think if anything, it's maybe made me that and other things just made me a better listener, to kind of like place what I'm hearing in larger context.
Right. Well, I know that you mentioned that after you left IKEA and you resigned, that you were determined to never to only work in an arts related field. And but I'm curious, when you look back at the experiences you had at IKEA, was there anything? What do you think you took from it the most, or was there anything about it that you think in some ways did in any way inform your practice or the way that you think?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think that IKEA. I mean, just Scandinavia in general, and the fact that Rooney is Scandinavian, right? That he's Norwegian, and I think he grew up, with socialist ideals, with socialism being a normal kind of perspective on how you look at things. It's something that Rooney and I have talked about so many times, and he actually craved a non-socialist environment. And so we've talked a lot of times about like what are the sacrifices and the gives and takes of either one of those, and IKEA is kind of interesting because it really does start from like everyday products for everybody kind of scenario of like hard work and like knowing where the products come from and seeing how that did not translate into American consumer culture. And how much American consumer culture is dependent on, the kind of structure of commercializing, of branding, and to see IKEA struggle to brand themselves in the US, it's really difficult to brand a basic product for everyone at a low cost to Americans because we're kind of distracted and want the branded item. So we don't want basic. And I say we, I'm talking about the kind of general public who's buying things. And, IKEA didn't do commercials. IKEA doesn't do sales. So the idea of activities manager was to think of interesting ways to get people to pay attention to a product without marking it down and doing a sale without, they even used to, I think they did do commercials for a while. And part of it was how Swedish people couldn't say the word sale. So they'd say like sale, it's on sale, and just say like there was no word in IKEA's language for sale, and even like their kind of like policies for employees, even down to the uniform. The uniform is actually there to create an equity among people, but the truth of it is it's depressing. Like the truth of it is you just feel like you're putting on like your like prison yard suit, and it's like you find yourself, I know a lot of people who I knew there trying to find our ways to like individuate our uniforms. But it was like, it's kind of depressing. It's like, oh, I have a cuff on my like navy pants or or I don't know, like a different cut of navy pant, or it, putting like a, I think we could put like a colored um, polo shirt underneath, so we could have like a collar. But so I think, to me, like that kind of line between, I suppose, like attempts at equity, attempts at kind of creating collective culture, attempts at trying to find, excuse me, find another kind of strategy of communication, um, branding, like whatever that means, which I think is certainly a part of the art world at this point. Um, I think that is a lot of the things that really, the way that I saw IKEA, for sure. And they're saying, I mean, especially because, I run a studio here with, we have about 13 people who work here. And so I am an employer. And I will say that those conversations around equity and what is right are not so dissimilar than maybe some of the perspectives at some place like IKEA. And again, that was, my gosh, almost 20 years ago now for me. So who knows what it is today? I still have friends who still work there, but it is interesting. It's like a weird kind of trap.
Yeah, and I'm really struck by. I'm really interested in what you're describing of sort of the socialist ideals, and thinking about that, and thinking about how objects carry those histories and those missions and ideals. But I'm also really interested in the way that you present your work. I think that I was struck, when the show came from the Welland Museum to the Blanton. I was really struck by some of the presentation decisions that you and the curator made together, and the way that the ceramics were installed, not just on the typical pedestals that museums provide. You had really very deliberate choices, and also the amount of color that you used. I remember almost every exhibition I've ever curated or that I see of contemporary art typically has white or gray walls. And your show, I can't remember the brand names of the paint, but I remember there was a bright yellow, an electric blue, a raspberry, and this sort of beautiful eggplant tinged brown, purpley brown. And I'm just curious if some of that you think is informed by like a sensitivity that you honed and thinking about the overall groupings and presentations. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that, because it is a sort of hallmark of your practice in my mind.
Well, I think that, I don't disassociate retail environments from art. I think that there's, the thing that's interesting about retail is retail cannot transform a customer. Retail speaks to the core of who the customer is. It's too expensive and too much work to try to change the mind of someone who's coming in looking for something. So the way that it really operates is it has to appeal to what is already happening. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And so there are certain things that I feel like color and even just kind of how color and walls or light kind of move us through a space. We could talk about it certainly in very high art terms, artistic terms, and we could term it architectural, environmental, installation. We could probably have that same conversation and talk about retail and like floor plan layout and like, where do we need to put the plants? And it's like, where are people going to stop and look at the rugs? Like, where are they going to be able to throw them out? Or maybe we should have them next to like the coffee table so people could put the coffee table on top and see it. So those conversations, to me, I don't really have a separate perspective on how I think about space. Like, that's not necessarily high-low to me. I'm more interested in how the environment feels and how that feeling kind of directs us to some degree, or at least presents us with maybe like some choices, like some coherent choices. And I think for the most part with exhibitions and color, it's interesting to me. I mean, I'm not even necessarily critical of like the white box space. I actually like the white box space for lots of things because it gives you like a clarity to be able to just focus on something. But I also am somebody who just inherently, I will overhang a show. I have no problem putting things right up next to each other. I like things when they cross sight lines, and I think that it's a way for viewers to think about more than one thing, and the connection between those two things. So I think there's always a conversation happening between things in a space, and that's something that I always think about, And one of the questions that comes up oftentimes when I'm working with like curators is like, is it one piece or two pieces? Like, do you want people to see this as one piece? And I'm like, no, it's they're two works, but they're relative to each other. And I think it makes it more experiential if you put them in a way where a viewer kind of has to see them together.
I'm so glad, though, that you're bringing this up because it's making me rethink the values that the art world holds and why it is that walls are traditionally, for contemporary art in particular, white or gray. And it's kind of a uniform for museums, for contemporary art shows. And I think what you're getting at also, but in talking about being comfortable talking about art and retail and the shared language and the ways that there are underlying connections is of great interest to me too, because part of the motivation for this exhibition, Day Jobs, is really trying to dismantle the elitist plane of art making and artistry. I think that there is a way in which it seems more serious as a curator. Maybe it's more serious to have white walls or gray walls, and that if you start to have these bright colors, it's getting too close to a store, too close to retail. And we're trying to create these visual cues to signal that we're more serious and that this is it's an elitist enterprise, when in fact, I think that there's all these hierarchies built into those decisions, and you're right. It's much more interesting to think about the ways that all of the spaces that we navigate can be more enticing, or make us feel welcome or excite us. And you're open about that in a way that I really appreciate. And you think about that, and you're not. I just really appreciate that about you, and I think it really worked. I mean, I really saw the response to the work was amplified by the choices that you made in the presentation.
Well, an example would be, so Tracy Adler, at the beginning of us planning the exhibition, she said to me, she said, "Well, is there something that you would like to do that you haven't done before?" And we were talking about fashion, and it kind of helped me really articulate that it's like, yeah, I pay attention to fashion. I'm really very much impressed with like the history of like atelier, couture, handcraft. And we talked about the relationship of the handwork in traditional indigenous garments versus, let's say, like couture houses, and the value systems and where they kind of split and where they cross over. And so that led us to the garments, and the garments had been in my head for a long time, but the conversation became about how do we move away from fashion, or what does it mean to move away from ready to wear to something? Is it couture? Is it wearable? What do those terms mean? So we were pulling a lot of language from, retail. I mean, a lot of those things are conversations that sit very comfortably in retail. And then the idea of like, how do we show them? And the original thing was like, is there a mannequin out in the world that makes sense to put these garments on? And I spent a lot of time looking at mannequins. I think we even ordered some. And I realized that I was like, these mannequins don't make sense at all. And a person who I'd like to bring up, who I think uses mannequins incredibly well, is like Isa Genskin. And I'm a huge fan of Isa Genskin. And I think whether she's conscious of it or not, a lot of her decisions are very aligned with things that happen in retail, even in their kind of slickness of being anti-retail, but the language is very similar. And, so then I made my own mannequins. They were these cement blocks that had a steel post in them, where they had plywood cutouts that we padded and covered in muslin fabric. And I was trying to make a figure that was non-gendered, that was non-raced, non-cultured, and they just looked corny. They looked really corny. We made 10 of these things, and it took us 2 years to get rid of them. And eventually, I was looking around the studio, and I was thinking, what is it that can almost let the garment be the sculpture and not the figure? And I was looking around, and we had these teepee poles, and I was like, the teepee poles. I was like, let's try a teepee pole. And it just worked. It elevated the garment. It had it floating in space. The whole placement of it became part of how you would conceptually describe the garment. So I think to me that was where the conversation around mannequin or no mannequin led to, and has continued. And not only is it one teepee pole, but it was two teepee poles that were lashed together so that the thin ends cross over each other, and you end up with a more kind of uniform post. And then those are lashed together with rawhide.
Interesting. I also, I think in a similar vein, one of the most interesting installations that I've seen by you recently, where you essentially turn a museum sculpture into a mannequin, was from your recent show at the Brooklyn Museum, When Fire is Applied to a Stone, It Cracks. And I remember when you entered that show, there was this very striking, iconic sculpture, bronze sculpture by Charles Carey Rumsey called The Dying Indian on a horse, from the early 20th century. And I remember you had put these amazing moccasins directly onto the Native American person's feet. And then you had this display of moccasins that I believe was all from the Brooklyn Museum collection, assembled kind of the way you would in a shoe store or at Ikea.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was just so powerful. And I was curious because it in retro now I look at that and I think you were sort of bringing together the skills of a stylist and someone who, had worked at IKEA, but also really felt like it was part of this lineage of institutional critique as well. And thinking about how to, make these interventions within a museum space that make us rethink what we're seeing and how things have been presented and displayed and what we've consumed.
Well, I'll add, some other jobs that I had early. Right when I graduated from Royal College in London, I stayed there for a year afterwards. And I worked in a car rental company that basically marketed to British tourists going to the United States. And we needed to rent cars to them. So that was one job. But my other job was working as a stylist with a photographer who shot for Dazed and Confused magazine. And my job for my responsibilities for that job were both to create props for the photos, but then also to style the photographs. And then also when I was in New York, I worked for a catalog company that my job was as a stylist to style interiors for photos. So styling is something that I think is it's pretty great, and I love it. I love styling because it is it's literally taking things that already exist, and it's kind of like a collage. You're thinking about what is the best kind of collage, and when it's photography, you get to think about collage in 2D, and when it's installation, you get to think about collage in 3D. The Rumsey installation came together. It was one of the first things that came together, and so easily. And I was able to work with their exhibition designer to design that case that held them and how it would support the monument or the sculpture. And those moccasins, actually, I reached out to a beader who I only knew through Instagram at the time, named John Muri. He lives in Montana. And I reached out to him. I knew he took private orders to make moccasins for individuals. And I had been on his waiting list, and I knew this was my chance to get my pair of moccasins from him. And then I hadn't been successful finding another beater. So I finally said to him, I said, look, here's what's going on. Would you consider making these moccasins for this sculpture? And he did. He agreed. He was actually excited about it. And so he made them, and they were size 15s. The feet on the we had to trace the foot of the bronze outside in the back parking lot onto a manila folder. We had to do each foot, and this is how you do it too when you get your own moccasins made. Send those to him. When they arrived, they were too tight to get on to the sculpture. And we had like, I don't know, 2 weeks before the show opened. So we literally FedExed them back to Montana, and he painstakingly added a 1/4 inch all the way around the sole and beadwork. And it had to be like adjusted to beadwork. So if you look at those, they really are. I mean, one of the things that's interesting they wanted to get across was that those moccasins are unlike a shoe that you go out and buy today. They are always made specifically by someone, for someone, to the dimensions of their foot. They're not about, if they wear a size, I know I said a size 15, but they're not about that. They're about the foot of Jeffrey Gibson, the left foot of Jeffrey Gibson, the right foot of Jeffrey Gibson. And so I really wanted to not have that comparison to sneakers. To me, it is, going back to the 90s when I was working at the Field Museum and Native elders, when the curators or the directors of the museums would say, well, what is sacred? And then they would say, everything is sacred. And they felt like an impossible, how do you move forward with that? One person says, what is sacred? We don't know. The other person says, everything is sacred. And I realized it's like, well, if we were going on a buffalo hunt, and from that buffalo, there was going to become a wedding dress for, let's say, like an initiation rite ceremony, the meat was going to be served at the ceremony. 2 pairs of moccasins were going to be made from this buffalo hide. The ceremony starts with the prayer for the hunt, so that's how everything is sacred. Like they don't become one object. Like they all kind of originate from this one cultural practice that the community takes part in. So I think to me, it's just sort of like leaning into a kind of holistic perspective on objects, a holistic perspective on the kind of narrative of objects. And yeah, I think, even when we were talking about Brooklyn Museum, I remember our conversations, a lot of it were references to retail store fixtures. We talk about museum furniture, for instance. But again, there's this high-low. Like, do we talk about like retail fixtures or museum fixtures? And they share a very similar language.
Absolutely. And I also was struck by, I've seen that sculpture, that the Dying Indian, in many museums. I think it's a little bit like a Remington or something. It's one of these sculptures that is in countless museum collections. And what I think often for me, I've passed it by. It hasn't really caught my attention. It's sort of a fixture everywhere. And by putting the moccasins around and on the sculpture, you made us all look at it too and focus in on it and think about, what does it represent? And it just made us, made me anyway, really start to examine, why is this work, why is this work in so many collections? What is it saying? And I think that was part of the brilliance of your intervention too. It'd be kind of something that was always in the background and invisible suddenly is, we're all scrutinizing.
Well, and many of those pieces came into museum. Many of those pieces are the beginnings of some of these encyclopedic collections. Not in terms of the earliest object in the collection, but in terms of like maybe, when a lot of these museums were established or founded in the late 19th century, this is what began it, and now in 2021, and even before this, there are uncomfortable pieces to exhibit. The whole when the Met did the exhibition on the Western Bronze, and I was asked to come and give a tour of this exhibition, and they were all, Remington was in it. I don't know if Rumsey was in it, but you would know these sculptures. And one of the things that was so interesting to me was I looked at these sculptures and found so much homoeroticism in these sculptures, in the presentation of depicting Native American men, but using Italian boys, European men, to pose for these sculptures. And, I kind of took the liberty of saying, it's like, well, of course I'm going to look for this. It's you've invited Jeffrey Gibson to come in and give his interpretation, or what does he see when he looks at these sculptures? I don't have to follow any script. This is my hour-long, what does Jeffrey Gibson see? And I remember there were some enthusiasts who showed up to the talk, who I think were horribly offended by what I was talking about. But I just said, and they tried to disagree with me. And I said, you're more than welcome to disagree with me. But I've been invited here today as an artist to share what is it I see, And so many of them had that kind of Bacchus sort of like, submissive boy image, this kind of effeminate, languid body. And so that's what I pointed out and talked about.
So interesting. So interesting. I will now look at those sculptures with in a different way too.
Yeah, they actually are really important sculptures. I mean, as a collective kind of subject, why the Western bronzes existed. And they, here's another retail connection. Most of those bronzes also existed in people's homes. That was the period where you could own a modestly sized bronze and have it in your home.
Right, absolutely. So we're coming to a close, but I want to ask you to bring it again back to the retail. I do want to talk about merch, because another thing that really struck me when your show was at the Blanton in 2019, our shop manager really was excited about the work, and she always comes up with these great ideas of products to carry during the run of different shows. And I think it was typical stuff, maybe postcards, a t-shirt, a scarf, but every time I pass along merch ideas to artists, I will say that invariably most of it gets rejected, and I'm lucky if I end up with a postcard. And you were just the complete opposite. You said yes to everything and then had generated 100 other ideas, and I think that a lot of the things that you came up with sold out. I remember the camo sweatshirt that you designed was amazing, and in Austin no one can wear sweatshirts. You can wear them for a month, and somehow that sold out. So I'm curious, what entices you? You really love this, don't you? Love to design clothing, objects. I could just sense a joy,
yeah.
And this is your wheelhouse.
Yeah, I mean, I think I do pay a lot of attention to designers. I'm always looking for designers that maybe are not sold in high big box stores and stuff. I think, well, I love popular culture, and by love I don't mean that I actually appreciate and want all of it, but just I love watching it and how it kind of extends agendas and creates uniforms for people and provides some level of communication between us in a kind of day-to-day public way. And clothing is one of those things. And actually this summer, oddly enough, we are actually producing some pieces here in the studio with the idea that they're not artworks, but they are wearable garments. They are things that could actually be made. And, I don't really know why I'm doing that, to be honest. It's something that we've talked about. And there were some patterns coming up. And I was like, you know what, let's just do this. Let's just see what it looks like if we produce this. And, the studio, in fact, has become, although I am an artist and love producing paintings and objects and sculptures, I would say that there's a comfortability with the studio working, kind of dipping into design, and design meaning things that are not necessarily the unique one-off that can't be replicated, but something that is maybe more utilitarian, maybe more functional and more accessible, than art. And I guess in a weird way, I feel like the foundation for what that would be. And I was actually talking about this to someone in the studio the other day, and I was saying, how much I loved Donna Karan's 7 Easy Pieces. Brilliant. Keith Haring's Pop Shop, also brilliant. And the kind of collaborations that came out of there. And I've been invited to do collaborations, and when I'm ever invited to do something, I always just have to think about what makes sense, what makes sense to do. And that is something that I don't know. Oh, here's a great one. Nikki de St. Fall. Uh, Amazing jewelry pieces that she made. A lot of like artist jewelry, I think is really,
I didn't know that. I
yeah,
didn't know she had great jewelry. I love her work, and I grew up looking at her work, and I didn't know that.
I feel like I'm right about that, but I'm pretty sure there are like brooches or, you know, um, and I just think that there's something about an artist making something where we're given the liberty to not have to fit within the narrow lanes of like selling at Target, you know, that sometimes when we do commercial ventures, they don't actually make money. And I love that about it too. It's like, because once you enter into that market, people aren't spending money the way they do on art. People are spending money the way they do on like something they're going to put on their body. Yeah, so I don't know. Like I just really I'm open to it. I should put it that way.
I love that, and I want to wrap up here, but I can't wait to see the wearable garments. I look forward to that, and I know there will be a lot more to come. Just because I know you well enough at this point to know that this is there. There will be more. And I want to, you mentioned being an employer. I know you have, I think you said your studio has about 13 people in it now, upstate New York. And I know you're also a teacher, a professor at Bard. You've taught lots of students, and you care a lot about, I know that you care a lot about young artists. And I appreciate, one of the things that I appreciate about you is the way you've talked about your trajectory as an artist and been pretty candid about your struggles, and the fact that there were really challenging years and moments where you almost, stopped making art, or, things that you talked about. I think the challenges of trying to make a career, support yourself as an artist. And one of my motivations in organizing the show is to be more open and more openly acknowledge the way that economic and creative pursuits are intertwined in ways that can be productive and that are also really precarious, and just and talk about the realities of hard work and hanging in and figuring out how to pay bills and create a space for what you love. So I'm just curious, what advice, I mean, I know you're supporting artists by having them, employing them, and thinking about really carefully about the ways that you employ them, but I'm also curious, what advice have you given your students or perhaps your employees over the years to try to help prepare them for some of these challenges as well?
Um, I kind of go back to that old advice. A couple of things. One, it's always about the work. At the end of the day, it's always about the work. And if you're not making work consistently, I don't think that you can suddenly just sort of it's like a muscle that atrophies, or you keep working out regularly, you know. So you always have to be making or thinking or drawing or recording somehow, and you build that muscle. Um, and then I also think the long term picture of things is something that I always encourage. I've been around long enough now to kind of see people really kind of get a lot of attention very early in their careers, and then I'm not exactly sure what happens when we don't hear from them, for a while. But I think that, and I think there's lots of reasons. I don't think that there's any one single reason why that happens. I also tell my employees here, who are all artists, I say, look, I will make my experience transparent to you, but in no way do I think the way I've done things is right for everybody. I have chosen to pursue a career as an artist. I put all of my eggs into one basket, and there's no plan B. I don't know if that's for everybody, and I didn't come into this with the comfortability of that. I've learned to get myself there. I don't any longer have a problem public speaking. I don't have a problem sharing things. I don't. I have a very kind of abundant kind of perspective on the world. I don't think I don't think that someone like that competitive feeling of like there's not enough for everybody. I don't share that. Yeah, and I also just think the financial side of the art world is real. It's so real, and I think it gets easier the more you acknowledge it and talk about it, rather than to give in to the uncomfortability of talking about money and how it moves through the art world. And also, I tell my students a lot, I'm like, people who are really good art students don't necessarily become really good artists. A lot of times it's the people who were not great art students who figure it out, and really become the artists who we pay attention to. And part of that is because they have stories to tell that we haven't heard yet.
Yes, yes. Well, I think that is a perfect note to end on, because I agree. I couldn't agree with you more that we need to talk about the finances and not, and if that makes us uncomfortable, let's be uncomfortable, because it's the reality, and we're doing ourselves a disservice if we don't acknowledge that. So I'm sure your students and the artists that work in your studio are grateful for that transparency and openness. And I hope that as a culture, we're doing that more and more. And I hope this exhibition will create an opening as well and encourage people to be more open about these realities and issues. And I'm just so grateful that you have been so open with us today, with me today, and can't wait to share your work again in Austin in the Day Job Show in 2023.
Awesome. Well, thank you.